that I mentioned to you that I was just involved in this Doha debates thing where it was me versus the entire audience. And I'm so tired of this conversation about colonialism and slavery and whatever that I just gave them both barrels on both of those issues. On slavery, and I talked about the fact that if it wasn't for the British Empire, most of the world would still be practicing slavery. The only thing that makes the West's history of slavery any different, really, is that we were more technologically advanced, so we could transport people across oceans, and the fact that we ended slavery.
Hey friends, welcome back to the new show. Konstantin, I don't know if you've seen, but we rebranded and we kind of got serious. We put suit jackets on, we took things serious, and we had people like you on. Thanks for being here, my friend.
This is not very serious if you're opening with me, but thank you for having me anyway.
It's very serious. You have been one of the people I've been wanting to chat with for the longest time. Francis as well, but you in particular, and I'll tell you why. I kind of hit it off with you in a way I didn't expect to, and it could be the fact that your lack of empathy, the fact that you're Russian, your face doesn't move very often. And to be honest with you, I didn't expect to connect with you at all. So when I did, I was pleasantly surprised. Russians and I don't really have a good vibe going. So I was stoked that you were willing to come on the show. But more importantly, man, you have done a lot in the very short period of time that I've gotten to know you, and an impressive amount, to say the least. And you've really rattled a lot of cages across the pond. And I want to talk about your life because you talk about the world, but you don't really talk about your life too often. And I know you have a series coming up with your dad, but before that comes out, I want to dive into a little bit of that. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Most people don't ask me about my life, so it's the only reason I haven't talked about it, but go far away.
Okay, cool. So you come from a really interesting background. You are Russian and Ukrainian, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
So a little bit more complicated than that. I was born in the Soviet Union in Russia, in the Russian part of it. Culturally, I would say I'm Russian, but that wouldn't necessarily make me that. It's a very controversial thing to say in the current context, but until very recently, there was not this giant cultural gap between Russians and Ukrainians. So, for example, my dad, culturally Russian, my mom is Ukrainian, my wife's Ukrainian. Like there's not a huge amount of difference, generally speaking, in terms of culture, attitudes. There's similar places. But ethnically, my mom is Ukrainian, as I say. My father my father's a half Greek, Pontic Greek. So these are Greeks who lived in kind of what is now Turkey, and half Jewish. So, but culturally, very, very Russian. And that's my background.
Okay, so let's go into that a little bit because I was reading, and by reading, I mean I was listening to your audiobook, which I was also pleasantly surprised that you read, because I do love when an author reads their own book, although you at 2 times is a lot for anybody on a good day. So let's talk about it a little bit. So I got to know you because I so boldly applied to be on your show TRIGGERnometry, which you host.
Don't tell them that. Now I'm going to get like 1,000 messages.
Yes, but the difference
we
is
reject them all. You were different.
You do. I know it. You do reject them all. The difference is I'm a psychopath, and I am just so relentless that I will get there.
Yeah.
That is the difference. So let's talk about it a bit because you have this amazing show with Francis, and I want to get into a little bit about how you got from the boarding school side of things, coming to the UK, and then into this really amazing show that you've been doing since 2018. So let's start with the idea of having to leave the USSR, listening to the book, kind of diving into your background. I can't imagine putting my kid on a train or a plane at such a young age and say, hey, you can't speak the language, see you later.
Yeah, so by the time I left, my parents sent me to boarding school, was already Russia. And my parents were one of the few people who were, for a very brief period of time, very successful in that chaotic time. So my dad was making pretty good money, and everyone else around was terrible. The schools were crumbling, the infrastructure was crumbling. I wrote a Substack called Why Russians Support Vladimir Putin, and in it I talk about what the 90s were like for the vast majority of people, and it was really catastrophic for the overwhelming majority of people. So you went from an not particularly successful, not particularly happy, not particularly wealthy society, which was the late Soviet Union, to complete chaos, war, terrorism. Suddenly you had prostitutes everywhere. Suddenly the people with the most power were no longer the people who were in the formal hierarchy who'd worked their way up the communist system, but they were just criminals. They were people who were killing each other, shooting each other in rival gangs, fighting for control over resources. And they were the ones that rose mostly to the top of that society. So well, my parents, my dad wasn't involved in any of that, but he was making good money, and he could see that the society in which he was raising his kids was really not a good one. And he was one of the few that had the opportunity to send his son abroad for a proper education and to really kind of be outside of all of this chaos that was around him. Um, and so my parents sent me to boarding school, and it wasn't like, as you say, no, most parents wouldn't really want to do that with their 11 or 12 or 13-year-old, but it was really, they felt that that was better than what I was likely to have around me. Plus, truthfully, my relationship with my dad at the time, my parents had me very young. So my dad was 20 when I was born, and my mum had been 18 for 4 days. So they were very young. They really didn't know what they were doing, um, as evidenced by the fact that they had me, among other things. And so by the time I was starting to become a teenager, I was 13, I was already developing my personality, and my father didn't really know how to handle it. So, I have a great relationship with him now, and we love each other, and it's all great. But at the time, he was objectively a bit of an asshole. And so our relationship became kind of like unstoppable force meets immovable object. And so I think my parents also kind of outsourced my teenage defiance to the boarding school to deal with as well. And do you want to double click on any of that, or do you want me to carry on?
Yeah. No. But I was. God, you're such an interviewer. I can tell. So okay, I do. I actually do. Yeah. So I just didn't want to interrupt you. I want to talk a little bit more about your father and the background as to why maybe you two were those immovable objects and you slammed up against each other. You came from a very different background, came from a very different time in life where conversations like I was listening to in your book, which were very different to hear and were, to be honest, very jarring to hear, which were, we were never having the conversations about things like gender. We were having the conversations about you cannot talk openly outside of this home about things, otherwise really bad things would happen. So can you talk to me about that and what that was like as a child?
Yeah, so that particular conversation, I remember my parents, by the way, in the interview I've just recorded with my dad, he didn't remember it, ironically, not least because he's now kind of in a Soviet reminiscence phase where he thinks things weren't as bad as they were and blah, 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 which is interesting.
Yeah.
We can get into that if you want. But
Yes.
at the time, in the late Soviet Union, my family, both sides of it, had really terrible things done to them by communists in the society. So it was a society of people who were really afraid of each other. They were really afraid of the government. And so my parents sent me to school as a 7-year-old, would say to me, make sure you don't talk about any of the stuff that we talk about in the home at school, because we'll be in trouble. And it wasn't really academic for them. So for example, my grandmother, she just turned 95, lives in Ukraine. When the communists came during the Holodomor to their house in Ukraine, she accidentally told one of these people that her mother was hiding away some of her supplies somewhere. And basically, because of that, the entire family was deported to Siberia, and her little brother starved on the way. So this was within our family's DNA, if you like, this idea that if you say the wrong thing, and it really was in everyone's DNA, everyone knew that you were not supposed to talk about certain things and have certain opinions and make certain jokes and all the rest of it. So they were having the conversation with me about, well, you can't say this at school, whatever. But I think in terms of my relationship with my dad, if that's what you're asking about, it was more, I think I'm a father now, and you're a parent as well. So that to some extent, I think, particularly with people like us, I feel like we've attempted to work on our shit a little bit. You realize that so much of parenting is just like the trauma that you were passed down by previous generations. So like when I really made peace with my childhood, it was partly the realization that like my dad's mother, who was a single mother, used to, anytime he did anything wrong or got a bad grade or anything, she used to beat him with a belt until, he was black and blue. My dad never did that with me. And God knows what his mother's parents used to do to her to make her that way, and so on. So, like, I remember we had this guest on Trigonometry called Mark Walsh, and I was asking him, why do Russians, because he spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, why do we have this, he calls it the Russian smile, which is just like this cold face. And he was like, because of Russian history. And like, if you read Russian history, it is absolutely brutal. So it's a generation. I mean, Jordan Peterson, and I talked about this. You just kept talking about how Russians are this culture of really amazing but really traumatized people. And I think fundamentally it's true. So I look at the mistakes my dad's generation made and the way that they raised us and so on, and versus us. And I just think we're all trying to do better compared to where we come from. And my dad was objectively way better compared to where he came from. So I think that's kind of the way I see it now.
Well, it's interesting too, because intergenerational trauma and what we understand now from the lineage perspective, whether it's through DNA or blood work or your genetics, we're able to see markers in people who have had trauma, whether that's head injury or otherwise, and to see that you've been able to kind of track that along and see that he's actually done better, even though he didn't beat you, even though he was beat, that is a win, which still doesn't help the developing face. I mean, a whole nation going through the trauma that it had. I was reading recently in one of your Substack when you were discussing, what you went through with your dad on these topics. One of the ones was, rebuilding the USSR and trying to get that back. And to me, that just seems like horrific. It seems like the idea of trying to rebuild something. And I want to get into Russia a little bit and the USSR, because there is somebody that I have been seeing has been speaking quite publicly about how Russia is this really beautiful place, how Russia is this really amazing place, how everything's really clean, how there's nothing really bad going on, and I can see your face. So we're going to digress a little bit, and I want to talk about how your feelings around how, Tucker has kind of revamped Russia to this, glory state that apparently it is. And I know you have feelings about that.
Well, more importantly than feelings, I have facts about that, which I think matters a lot more. So in terms of Tucker, just to be clear, I think it's important for anyone listening to know that there are lots of things in which I actually agree with Tucker. That's why he had me on his show several times. When my Oxford speech went viral, he had me on then. And also when I turned down a contract to do a comedy gig, which said that they had a bunch of restrictive policies. So I agree with Tucker about free speech. I thought that, for example, during the summer of 2020, he was literally the funniest comedian on TV talking about what was happening and BLM and everything. He was like, remember that Chaz thing? And he was talking about it, and he was like, do you know the first thing they did? They built a wall. So I think we live in a world now, it really bothers me that when you criticize certain people's ideas or something they said, people automatically assume that you think that person is uniquely evil and a terrible person, and you're coming after them personally. I very strongly disagree with Tucker's entire approach to the Russian-Ukrainian war and to all of the other stuff that he's been doing. And the reason is that he is misleading the American people and misrepresenting many of the things that are happening there. I can give you a whole load of examples, but the Substack you're talking about specifically, I talked about his infamous trip on the Russian metro and his miraculous discovery that Russian supermarkets have shopping carts that you can return and get your rubles back or whatever it is. This is apparently something that doesn't exist in the West, although it exists in every supermarket.
We
everywhere.
have it.
Yeah, you have it. And likewise, the thing that really bothered me is when he said that food is cheaper in Russia. And yes, if you have an American salary, food is cheaper in Russia. But if you have a Russian salary, which is what matters, then actually food is 3 times more expensive in Russia. The average Russian household spends about 3 times as much on food than the average American household. And that's not because Russians eat more at all. Right. So, and by the way, the thing I laid out in that Substack, and I think this is important to point out, is Tucker isn't the first intelligent and otherwise courageous and smart person to be misled in this way. George Bernard Shaw was misled by Stalin in exactly the same way. And the reason was he was very frustrated with the failures of his own society, the failures of democracy. And so when that happens, when you see that, as you do, as you well know, in every major American city now, the wealthiest country in the world, the most successful country in the world, the greatest country in the world, in my opinion, nonetheless.
And brought to you by Mindful Meds. You guys have been seeing me take Mindful Meds for a little while now. Mindful Meds is a premium supplement company dedicated to supplying humans with the tools to improve their mental health, clarity, and performance, all while supporting their growth along the way. Whether it's the Immunity Blend, Lion's Mane, Inspire, or Voyage, all of their products are clean, tested, consistent, and they've become a huge help in my life. I found Mindful Meds over a year ago now, and I've never looked back. Go check out their website, mindfulmeds.io, and use the code BRASS at checkout.
When you walk around, you see barely dressed, drug addicted, homeless people everywhere. And you go, is this the great society that we're supposed to celebrate? You know, and all the other frustrations that people like Tucker would have with the United States, with the open border and whatever else, these are legitimate concerns. And so when you look at Vladimir Putin, you go, well, he's got his borders locked down, right? The streets of Moscow are clean and beautiful. The streets of most other cities are not, by the way, but the streets of Moscow are. You know, it's very difficult to keep the context of the rest of everything that's happening in Russia in mind. And it's very easy to be misled by your own frustrations about your own society. And I think that's where Tucker and many other people have ended up.
Well, it was a hard one to kind of watch. Obviously, I understand journalism is what journalism is, and a good journalist goes and travels and does the things and has the hard conversations. And so I'll never fault somebody for attempting to have a conversation, because you know, when you stop talking, that's where the darkness grows. And so we need to have those hard conversations. You, of all people, know that more than ever. You've put yourself in the line of fire several times, whether it's in Oxford, whether it's in debates. I've listened to some debates recently where I have zero clue how you kept your cool or how you didn't clock someone in the face. You are way more patient than I am. Just the over talking and just the anger and just the negativity spewing from either side. I'm speaking to a particular debate where you had two individuals. I believe it was on stage. There was a female involved for the first time. I can't remember her name, but my God, it was
Brianna Jo Gray.
God, you know, thank you so much for having that beautiful mind over there. But it was a really hard debate to witness. It just felt like you can grab control of it, but at the same time, it's just so dark and it's so heavy. And so do you feel like you're uniquely qualified to be having these debates and having these really hard conversations due to the way you were raised, due to the way that you kind of came up in this world?
Well, you know, in the house, so my dad is even more of a contrarian asshole than I am.
I can't imagine that.
Hard to imagine, I know, but he is. So like, I'm translating our interview now, and I'm getting more annoyed with my dad because he's like, why? But anyway, so in the house, we used to, but also he's a smart and very well-educated, erudite guy. So we would go back and forth, him and I, my mother and him, and all the rest of us. So the idea that you would discuss difficult ideas and challenge each other and disagree without losing respect or love for each other, to me, that's how you talk, right? It's how you connect. And it's funny because I haven't done any debates myself for a while. So the one you're talking about, I moderated that one.
You were moderating.
In the last couple of days, I did I went on Safety and Amos's podcast, and he wanted to argue with me about Israel and Palestine, and it got very heated. And then I did a Doha debates thing where it was like literally me versus the entire audience and the rest of the panel. And I just came away from it feeling great. To me, this was like, oh, finally, my life is fun again. So I do enjoy it. And also, as you mentioned, you're taking the piss out of me, but it is true. I am not naturally a high empathy person. So when someone starts using emotion to try and win the argument, I'm like, no.
Disgusted.
Like, I'm just like, no. That doesn't make any logical sense. Can you answer my fucking question, please? And so what happened in that debate was very much in the debate you're talking about. It was about Israel and Palestine, and it was Eli Lake and Michael Moynihan on one hand, and Brianna Joy Gray and Jake Klein on the other. It was this thing called Dissident Dialogues that we were at. It's available on our channel if people want to watch it. it got very heated, and I just basically, a lot of people, when they moderate debates, they just want to like let everyone else talk. And I do too. I want to bring the best out of everybody, but I also think that it's almost like this old school BBC thing where you're supposed to actually press both sides on the things that they're saying. And of course, what happens in the modern world is people go, well, you pressed me, therefore you're biased against me.
Right.
So this is what this Brianna Joy Gray idiot tried to do afterwards. She tried to claim that I am somehow not impartial in a debate, even though anyone who watches that debate could look at it and go, Konstantin prompted both sides equally and actually gave the pro-Palestine side more talking time to get their points across, and particularly Brianna Joy Gray. But then she tried to say that because I pressed her, that means that I'm a Zionist and I was unfair. And that's where I'm like, well, now the gloves are off, because if you question me or my opinions or whatever, that's totally fine. If you question my impartiality, now you've crossed the line. So that's the point from which I went at her pretty hard, and delighted to say I think that discredited her in the eyes of a lot of people, as frankly she did herself. So yeah, but I enjoy debates. I think they're good. I think they're important. I think if done correctly, they're a way to get to the truth. Sometimes it's a bit of a freak show, and that can happen as well. I like those less, but sometimes you go for the good, healthy debate and the freak show breaks out, and what are you going to do?
Well, it was interesting watching that debate in particular, because it seemed like you were hoarding cats together. Really, it was a nightmare to kind of watch at the beginning, because she was not only just over talking everyone, but she was just throwing just facts that didn't seem to line up, in my opinion. And now I'm not an economist. I'm not on the ground counting dead bodies. I'm not going to sit there and argue with her. I know where my lines are and I stay kind of within them. But at the same time, it still felt like some of the things she was pulling out were just woke ideology and just woke terms and just this way of trying to put her point forward, which really just made her, like I said, and not to be degrading, it did make her seem like an idiot up on that stage. And so I am glad that you did go back at her, because that is the thing I see so often. And we see this in America right now, right? Like, for those that know, obviously I'm Canadian, so I don't really have a skin in this game, but on some level I do, right? Because I live beside the country, and everything that happens to them seems to radically impact me. And so watching some of these debates and seeing how poorly they're moderated, I mean, I'm sure you witnessed the last American debate and the new one that's coming. That was just a disgrace and really disgusting, in my opinion. So if you were to do that differently, what would you press them on, if anything?
Well, look, I thought that debate was incredibly well moderated. It's the candidates that are the problem.
Made it all look really just sad and pathetic.
Yeah, I actually watched that debate to try, because I like to comment on things, and I was going to write an article about it, and I just couldn't. It is absolutely terrifying. The most powerful country in the world, on which we all rely. You make a good point about how what happens in America doesn't just stay in America. I always say all the craziness, all the crap that they flush down the toilet, we all get served for breakfast the next day. And that's, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, in the rest of the Anglosphere. So it really does matter. It's very worrying. What I think if I was hosting that debate, I would go a lot harder at both of them. I don't necessarily know what that would look like for Trump. There's probably things to do with his recent trials or whatever, where you just go, Mr. President, should this country have a convicted felon as president, right? Or convicted criminal or whatever. But with Biden, I mean, the obvious question is, have you been tested for dementia, and what was the result?
Correct.
That's what you got to ask, right?
Well, also, just do a drug test like any other athlete or anybody else has to do. We could tell that you're on cocaine at a bare minimum, every amphetamine. The way the pace he was speaking was radically faster than anybody, and that's coming from me. And so the fact that I couldn't understand him, and he was mumbling, and he was quite literally making an ass of himself, would just take that out like completely on its own. Just cognitively, I'm hyper concerned about somebody like that having his fingers, i.e. the people around him or Jill, with their fingers on the buttons.
Well, this is an important distinction, Kelsey. Sorry to interrupt.
Right. Go ahead.
This is a thing that a lot of people who are supportive of Biden staying in the race, they say this thing in their head, I think, in order to justify, which is like, if you and I say, well, this guy has the power to end all life on Earth, and they sort of go, yeah, but they'd never let him. And I'm like,
Who's they?
Bingo. Who is the they, and why are they in charge? Did you elect them?
Correct.
Right?
Right.
And this is the bit that they're all skipping. And the reason is they've got Trump derangement syndrome. So orange man bad trumps anything. And they will say it. I had people in my Twitter feed, like prominent commentators, not just random people with like, eggs as their profile, like real people saying, I would vote for anybody over Donald Trump. I don't care if it's a dead Joe Biden and he's just there being propped up by his advisors. And I'm going, well, with all due respect, I don't think you've thought this one through.
No, it's not that it's not even that they haven't thought it through. They don't understand the implications of the words that they just said. I understand that, and I'm careful to put myself in the bucket with you on this, so just bear with me. People who make money from podcasting for a living discuss hard topics. We slip up, we say the wrong things, we say it maybe in the wrong way, we say it with the wrong tone or with Russian resting face, but we say it. And the thing is we're willing to say it and to question it. And when we mess up or we say something wrong, we're willing to then walk it back and say, maybe I could have said it differently. I saw this recently with you on Twitter. Actually, I just started using Twitter, so I've been following a little bit of your back and forth, either with people or on your own. But I believe there was a comment said, and you very quickly, about a day later, walked it back and said, you know what? I'm working on how I discuss things. I'm working on how I'm able to articulate things. And maybe I said that one a little bit wrong. And what that stood out to me, what made that stand out to me was the fact that you were willing to look at what you had said, how you said it, and then correct yourself, not because of censorship, but because you believe, because you're intellectually a lot more advanced than others. I call it spectrumy. We're going to call it spectrumy for today. You're able to then look at your faults and go, no, there's just a better way for me to have articulated that. And it didn't come off the first time. So it is interesting to see that we can't even look at our words when it comes to things like Trump, and we can't look at our words when it comes to Biden, and we're not able to just call it what it is. The man has dementia. I understand that you're fearful of this other gentleman. And I use gentleman loosely because I'm trying to be respectful, because he still was the president of the United States. But at the end of the day, even though he's an absolute asshole, he's a misogynist, he's a douchebag, I'm going to take him over dementia any day. Because if you've ever sat with someone who struggled with their cognitive ability, you can't trust them to live on their own, let alone trust them with the nukes and all of the buttons and decision making. So if that means that America is being run by somebody else, that means that democracy we've got a bigger problem here. If we're all okay with these voted members, non-voted members controlling the entire nation, if the United States wasn't as powerful as it was, I would be less concerned. But I'm frankly hyper concerned. And I would like to think, based on your election that you just had, you're concerned as well.
Yeah, I think that situation is terrible. And by the way, your point about President Trump being a douchebag and a misogynist or whatever. Even if we were to accept all that, which I think probably factually is correct, then ultimately the question still remains: who is the best person to run this organization? Right? That's what the government is. And I've always thought that look, the moral side of things is important, and ideally in that position you would have people who are great role models and all the rest of it. But if it's a binary choice, I want someone who's competent and is going to run the organization. And the fact that they slept with a porn star and didn't pay all the tax, it's relevant, but it's not the deciding thing. I want somebody who's going to actually be capable of being in charge. So I'm very wary of getting involved in anything to do with American politics. I never would presume to tell people in another country how they would vote. I generally don't even talk about how I vote in this country either. I think as an independent commentator, it's important to stay out of it. But on this one, I think it's very clear that you can, at the very least, you cannot vote for Joe Biden. You just can't. Not if you're a sensible person. That's my opinion. People are, of course, welcome to disagree with it as they wish, but it troubles me very much that he's even on the ballot.
It's concerning. Do you think they're going to pull him?
I honestly don't know. I don't know enough about the inner workings of the system and how that one's going to play out.
I've spoken to a few individuals that are not too far from, let's say, the administration or within the government in the United States, and they seem pretty confident that there's no way they can run him. But yet every time they've polled somebody else, I don't know if you've seen recently, they did attempt to poll individuals. And again, polls are polls, meaning who actually responds to polls matters. And the only single human that was able to beat Trump was Michelle Obama.
Interesting. I don't know who else can beat him. I would imagine that someone like Gavin Newsom would have a good chance. You know, he is what Americans like in a politician: tall, handsome, great smile. You know, all of those things that for some reason matter. You know,
Says the Russian guy with the resting face doesn't understand why emotions matter. Okay.
No, I don't. Well, it's not even emotions. It's like, you know, having you know, a strong chin and a firm handshake or whatever. It's like,
you should understand that more than anybody.
Nah. I just want the guy to be able to run the country. I'm kind of weird like that. But Gavin Newsom, I think, would be certainly a stronger candidate than Joe Biden.
Right.
The problem is, and we should talk about this because, you know, coming back to our conversation about Brianna Joy Gray, I called her in our big exchange the DEI Barbie. And Jordan Peterson has taken that on, and he called Kamala Harris a DEI Barbie. And I think this is really the fundamental problem. And we should talk about it is because people don't talk enough about the damage this ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion is doing to everything. Kamala Harris, and this isn't some, you know, bigoted me saying this. This was Joe Biden saying this when he picked her. He said that my vice president is going to be a woman of color, right? That's what's going to have to happen. So we know she's a diversity hire. That's what we know. And the reason they can't say the president is incapable of fulfilling his duties for the rest of his term, let alone running again, let's have the vice president stepped in, is they picked somebody who wasn't qualified, and now they can't replace the president. Because actually it turns out that picking the right person for the job matters.
It does. It's always mattered. And that's the hard. I got a significant amount of flack after being on your show about some of the diversity questions and about some of this. And then after doing Jordan, so graciously, thanks to you, one of our clips went viral, and it was a DEI clip, ironically. And it was just about what's going on in this country. And so just for the listeners, if you don't know what I'm speaking about, Konstantin so graciously, again, telling him all the dirty secrets, just went to bat for me. And the reason this is important for you to know, I've told you this before, but my listeners know how much this is valued in this sphere that I walk in, and it's reciprocity and the willing to say someone's name in the room. And because of you, I got the opportunity to sit in front of somebody I've always wanted to sit and have a conversation with about. And we spoke about DEI. The reason DEI is such a big topic for me, at least in Canada, is because of the erosion of the country due to policies like DEI. If you look at the military, you look at the service, we have less than 15,000 active deployable service members. So that's deployable. That's not members that are running within our military. That's just what we can send somewhere else or when we get invaded by the CCP. So it's for us, sorry, we're being slow dripped invaded. It's like we're the frog in the pot right now. So when it comes to DEI, one of the things I had stated on the show was that when you have DEI, people get killed. And that is something we can point to, we can show, we can see it economically, we can see it from an immigration standpoint, we can see it now within the ranks of government. DEI is eroding what it means to be in a Western society. And what really struck me and kind of stopped me dead in my tracks was when I was listening to the way that you were describing socialism in the USSR, when you were describing how it was equity above all, when it was, you know, no rich person could actually be rich. They were only 4 times more wealthy than, I think you said 4 times, if I'm not mistaken, more wealthy than the average person, where nobody would have more than others. And that terrified the hell out of me, because as you were breaking down the system piece by piece, all I kept seeing was my own country. You were talking about the medical system and how people couldn't get access, where we have wait times of, on average, minimum of 10 hours to an ER. And people in my local ERs are just dying in the waiting room. And people act as if people like myself and you are lunatics for saying that we have an immigration problem, we have a flooding issue. And you also have this in the UK. So I want to pivot to that a little bit and discuss kind of what just happened in the UK with your election, what you've got with your growing, I would say, invasion, because we have a similar invasion, and our lack of ability to be able to do what these nations are meant to do, which is socialized healthcare, which is good school systems, which is not getting raped when you go into a park. Like there are things that we should just be able to do, but due to immigration and just the way our governments are running, we are being overrun. So talk to me about what just happened in the UK this week.
So there's several big questions there, obviously, Kelsey. The first thing is I've just published an article on my Substack in which I talk about how the Labour landslide, so Labour Party obviously being the left-wing party, they and one other, well, together with other left-wing parties, they now hold about 500 plus seats in the British Parliament out of 650. 500 out of 650. But my view is this actually represents the country moving to the right, not to the left. And I know you might be wondering what I'm smoking. I'm not smoking anything. It's actually a very fact-based point of view. So what happened was we've had 14 years of the Conservative Party being in charge. And the Conservative Party, as you say, has not dealt with illegal immigration. So we have tens of thousands of people coming here on small boats. And the argument is, well, these people are fleeing war and misery and terror and rape and whatever, and persecution. Problem is, they're coming from France. Now, I know as a British person, I do think France is a bit shit, but it's not that bad, right? So having that doesn't make sense. And the reason it's really happening is that there's a lack of political will to deal with the legal system, the European Convention on Human Rights, which basically says you have to let these people in because it's the legal thing to do. And frankly, the argument from the rest of us is, well, if that's what the situation is, we are a sovereign, independent country. We do not want to be having the situation. Let's pull out of the ECHR. Let's have our own Bill of Rights where we protect the things that we should be protecting, right? Because there's some good about the ECHR, but we also get to set our own immigration policy. And by the way, this is endless argument. I'm sure I haven't followed Canadian politics closely, but I bet you're being told it's impossible to stop. There's nothing we can do. It's just the way it is, right? Bullshit. I was in Australia earlier this year, and I got to meet Tony Abbott, who's the former prime minister. Now, before he came into power in 2013, they had about 17,000 people coming into Australia by boat every year, which for a country with a population of 30 million is a lot. Today, I think last year they had 74 people come in by boat, right? So they dealt with it. And it's not very hard. You just have to strap on a pair and actually do some things to take on the courts, take on the political resistance, whatever, and actually deal with it. So it is possible. And so, yes, we've got that issue. The other issue we have, and again, you probably have this issue in Canada, is that you're being lied to about why there's mass legal immigration. So we talked about illegal immigration. There's also legal immigration. And what you're being told is that we need people to do jobs, right? And this is true because what we have is an aging population in which people are having fewer and fewer kids. So the only way you can really sustain that situation is if you bring in more people to do low skill, low wage labor, and it's like a pyramid scheme. You keep expanding the bottom rung of the pyramid. So the immigrants of today are going to get taken care of by the immigrants of tomorrow, and they're going to get taken care of by the immigrants, and then it never ends, right? The truth is that all that's happening is you're pricing your own young people out of the housing market because you're increasing the population without increasing the infrastructure. Young people are therefore not pairing up, not having kids. Therefore, we don't have enough people there. We have to bring in more. And you're also being told that immigrants, these low-skill, low-wage immigrants, are rapidly and helpfully improving your economy. It's really not happening. What's happening is you're improving your statistics of economic growth, right? You're not improving your GDP per capita, which is what actually matters. So the UK is 6th in the world in terms of GDP. We're very, very wealthy, except we're 27th in terms of GDP per capita. So we're a very poor, rich country, effectively. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of parallels with that in Canada. What we should have, and what we've been promised over and over, is very simple. we should have zero illegal immigration because it's illegal. And so we may have one or two boats slip through, but ultimately we should be as forceful on that as we would be on an actual invasion on our border, right? If a bunch of hostile enemies were coming in on boats, I think we'd send people out to deal with it. That's what we should be doing. And on legal immigration, what we should be doing is bringing in as many talented, driven, educated, passionate young people who are compatible with our cultural values, because they're the next Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and the whoever's, while also not bringing in people who are not going to be net contributors to our society, because that's not beneficial to us. And, part of what's happening is politicians are lying to you because they want to be able to say that the economy is growing, because that's the only thing anyone seems to care about. And they don't seem to care about the cultural damage that they're doing to the very fabric of society, and all the issues that you raised about crime and cultural integration and all of that. But the other reason is that they've started to, because they don't want to tell you the truth about why they're bringing these people in, they're also lying to you about they're presenting immigration as a moral issue. Like, we have to take people, like we've got to welcome lots of people, and we need to get Japan to take more people, and we need to and the question is, like, why? Like, why is it a moral issue? Why is it moral to welcome hundreds of thousands of people into your country when your own veterans are sleeping in cardboard boxes? Why is that the moral decision? And no one has explained that to me.
Well, and forget the morality of it. Forget that there is veterans. Forget that 1 in 3. Forget that the suicides are the 44. Forget all of the statistical facts that are, you can walk down the street and see. Talk about the cultural perspective of it. So the UK has a culture. Canada had a culture. Canada had a way of life. Americans had a way of life. But more and more, I keep seeing these really radicalized individuals who are not facing prosecution in any way, shape, or form due to the system being unwilling to prosecute. So take example, we're the 8th today. On July 1st was Canada Day. This was one of the years where we can actually say Happy Canada Day. Otherwise, normally we have to say, hey, sorry, we stole your land and murdered everyone and put you in concentration camps kind of vibe. So we could say Happy Canada Day this year, but instead it was met with pro-Palestinians and I say pro-Hamas because they're two very different, but there were pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinians in Toronto burning Canadian flags, burning American flags down in the South. And there is no police to be found. There is nobody saying that that is a moral qualm, an issue, that we should be addressing it. Look at the universities. This thing spreads the gamut. You could look at everything from schools all the way to government officials, top to bottom, and there seems to be no accountability and there seems to be no repercussion for these actions. Whereas I remember when I was younger, because we're not super far off in age, but if you were caught burning a flag of the country in which you lived in, that was not only a hate crime, but it was seen as an act of terrorism because it was inciting some sort of violence or rhetoric. And what I don't understand is seeing individuals in this country and in your country, because when I was there in London, walking down the street, witnessing what I was witnessing, it felt like I was in this dystopian, strange parallel universe where all of a sudden the police would witness this and nobody would be held accountable. And I'm wondering, how do we continue if we're never going to hold these people accountable? Because we have mass immigration. We have individuals that are very clear. They come to our countries and they say, this place is shit. Your women suck. They shouldn't have rights. Your children shouldn't be able to go do X, Y, and Z. Your politics are garbage. We should be shooting your police and then walking out on the streets of New York and getting away with it. The message we're sending, how the hell do we stop this without deporting everyone? And furthermore, we don't even know who's all here. So how do we know who to deport? And what is that going to then cost a system to deport millions of individuals who are, whether they're known terrorists, whether they just have done something in the country while they've been here that would either put them in prison for life? How do we handle something along this lines?
Well, the first thing you have to do is to stem the tide, right? Because no matter how many foreign criminals you identify and deport, if you keep importing more every day, if you've got the faucet open in the bathtub, and it doesn't matter how much water you remove, you're going to struggle to keep the water from going up instead of down,
Right.
right? So the first thing you have to do is have secure borders. This is something that was extraordinarily uncontroversial until about 2 minutes ago. In my book, which I know you've listened to, I have a whole chapter on immigration in which I quote left-wing, right-wing, centrist politicians of every stripe speaking about immigration over the last 20 years. All of them basically now sound like they're far right compared even to Donald Trump, because everybody used to agree that countries need borders, right? So the first thing you need is to have a border. The second thing you need is you need to have a zero tolerance on foreign criminality. If you are a foreign citizen, I was a foreign citizen of the UK until about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whenever it was. If you commit a crime, and it's a serious crime, I'm not talking about you got a driving ticket or whatever. I'm talking about a serious crime. You had your chance. That's it. You had your shot. You had your shot at being part of one of the most prosperous, open, welcome, free societies in the history of the world. And you chose to come here and rob somebody. Out, banned permanently, never coming back in. Go home and rob whoever you want in your own country, right?
So, but okay, take that. That's an example. That's a great example. But what if it's somebody that's not harmed anyone? What if they're inciting violence? What if they're burning flags? What if they're setting up protests saying that this country should be overrun? Like, where's the line for you, I guess?
Well, the line for me is where the law is, right? So, for example, in the United States, you have the First Amendment, under which people are allowed to say almost anything up to the point where they're literally inciting violence right there, right? So that is a constitutional matter for the American courts, and they can decide what is and isn't incitement to violence. The issue is that in the UK, we have spent the last 10 years watching people be arrested and have the police visit them to check their thinking over a tweet about trans issues. And then you've got someone chanting for jihad, and they're arresting the trans commentator, but they're letting the jihad person continue chanting. So that's kind of one where I'm like, let's just pick one. If you want to go full First Amendment, that's fine. Let's do that. But then that means we don't prosecute people for speech. We don't arrest comedians for making jokes. We don't lock people up for messages that they sent in private WhatsApp groups that were bigoted or racist or whatever, because they're private, right? People are allowed to say whatever they want in private. If you want to go with that model, I will tolerate the Islamist in the street saying whatever he wants up to the point of incitement to violence. Alternatively, if you want to have a society in which there are speech restrictions, particularly around incitement to violence, incitement to hatred, etc., these guys are doing it. Lock them up.
Right. Or how about deport them?
And then if they are foreign, deport them, of course.
Well, because see, that's where I know this is a bit of a dicey sentence I'm about to say, so bear with me. If you're inciting violence and you are trying to convert my country into a place that you think is so filled with rainbows and doesn't throw homosexuals off of bridges and doesn't burn people alive in cages, send them fucking there. Send them there. You get caught burning in a Canadian flag, you get caught inciting violence, you're going to where you're promoting. Bye. Get the fuck out. Why? Because you're eradicating my culture. And when I say eradicate, I'm going to tell you a personal story that you're not going to care about at all, but I'm going to tell it to you for the listeners. I took my son, since we have children, we're going to go down that route next. I took my son to a local beach. I'm not going to say where because I'd prefer people not to know where I live. I took him to a beach. I went in a bikini, not a skimpy, slutty bikini, in a mom bikini. It just happened to be red. And I'm fit enough to wear said bikini, I think. And we were there and I was pumping up paddle boards. I was accosted twice in the parking lot by Muslims. And I'm going to say the word Muslims because they were, and it was obvious because their wives were in burqas in the front seat. So they accosted me and said that I had no right to wear that I should not be out without a man, and then called me a fat whore in front of my son. Cool.
Hey, that is way out of line. You're not fat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Whore, different conversation though. So I'm in the parking lot. My son looks at me and he goes, "Mommy, what is their problem?" I said, "They just hate their life, honey. When bad people hate their life, then they take it out on others. It's just the perception." So we're walking through, we go to the ocean, we're sitting there on the paddle boards. Again, something is said about me to other people. And so what I didn't understand is if I were to go there 5 years ago, and I never thought I would be this person because I come from an immigrant family who left Hungary when, you guys invaded, and came to Canada. And he never went to Hungary again, never spoke about it, never saw his family, nothing. I have an immense amount of respect for people who leave their countries and come to another place that they do not know. But the other thing I have an issue with is if you come to the country and tell me that I can't live my life the way I wanted to live it. And not only that, is when you come into the country and you start to break down what it means to be Canadian. It bothers me. I never thought I would be that person. So many people call me bigoted and racist for this, but I'm worried that when my son grows up, and he is growing up in this nation, he doesn't know anything about his culture because we don't have a culture anymore. We are told because we are white, we should be hateful of ourselves. We are told that because we are white Canadians, we should every time we get up to say a speech, we should acknowledge the people's land we stole. Well, if you have a problem with the land you stole, give it the fuck back. Like, stop it with me in this idea that, well, I said that we stole it from the duck, 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 and then now we stand on here with our schools and we act as if that's okay. My son's school, that drives me cuckoo, celebrates Diwali, but not Hanukkah. So the thing that I'm struggling with in Canada is we are eroding any ideology we had of this country, any cultural, not even superiority, but this really beautiful idea that we were a first world nation that was free and that was safe and didn't have the censorship rules and laws. And I know that the UK is doing similar things, i.e. sending people to the doors over tweets about Freeland or over Trudeau and our right to be able to have these conversations in private spaces. So being a parent, is this one of the reasons you started to speak out publicly because of your child? Or was this like an innate need? Because for me, that's what it feels like. It feels like I don't have a choice now.
Yeah, I also felt that I didn't have a choice. And for me, it started with the fact that my parents, we didn't get to that part, but my parents, when they sent me
we're going to get there.
When they sent me to school in the UK, they very quickly afterwards lost all the money that they had. And so getting me here was literally them giving up their life savings. And then I wasn't really prepared to sit around and watch people with blue hair tear down the foundations of Western civilization because they just didn't know how lucky they were. And then when my son was born, of course, then that changes the way you see the world as well. And I think that, it's interesting because I know that a lot of people will hear what you were talking about and the visceral reaction will be to recoil and to say, oh, that's racist and whatever. But actually, I think what you said was perfectly articulated because it shows what a normal person who just encounters the real world experience of dealing with the consequences of this stuff naturally experiences when they encounter what is effectively an attempt to replace your culture with a different culture, one to which you didn't subscribe, one for which you did not vote, one under which you would not want to live, and nor would most Canadians. And yet you're finding yourself having this attempt to enforce it on you by men in a car park, right? Like that shouldn't be happening. I think that I mentioned to you that I was just involved in this Doha debates thing where it was me versus the entire audience. And I'm so tired of this conversation about colonialism and slavery and whatever that I just gave them both barrels on both of those issues. On slavery, and I talked about the fact that if it wasn't for the British Empire, most of the world would still be practicing slavery. The only thing that makes the West's history of slavery any different, really, is that we were more technologically advanced, so we could transport people across oceans, and the fact that we ended slavery. That's the only difference, because slavery continued to go on in the Ottoman Empire, and the trans-Saharan slave trade conducted by Arab slave traders was much worse than the transatlantic slave trade. I talked about the fact that Native Americans had slaves and Africans had slaves. And in fact, Africans were the one that sold the African slaves to the white slave traders because they wouldn't go near the continent, right? So all the slaves that were taken to the Americas were sold to the Europeans by other Africans because the history of slavery has been with human beings from the moment human beings became tribes. It was probably the first good that was ever traded between human beings, other human beings. And it was always the history that basically a tribe would conquer another tribe and enslave its people as labor. And that's how it was. The only thing that really makes us different is the fact that we ended slavery. As for colonialism, I'm glad you said like, if you really think it's stolen land, give it back. And that's what I keep saying to people. Or, when people apologize, we when I used to do comedy, you used to see this wave after wave of these morons going, you know what, 5 years ago I made this joke and now I really apologize because I've realized. I was like, well, then give your money and awards back. If you truly apologize, give back the awards, give back the money that you earn. Right. But no, all you're doing is cheap virtue signaling to say what a good person you are. Please don't cancel me. Right. So that's what they're doing. And this is what they're doing with stolen land. Now, let me let your audience in on a little secret that they may already know, some of them. All land is stolen.
Yes.
All land is stolen. And when I was in this Doha debate, I basically said to them, I'm getting very tired of this endless whining about colonialism, because to me, when I hear the word colonialism at this point, it just sounds like people who lost in the battle of civilizations whining about losing. That's all that's happening there, right? Right? Because, the Ottomans, they didn't have like, oh, we've enslaved all these people of Central Europe, but now they're really concerned about our colonialism. Let's do reparate. That's not how they were thinking about it. By the way, that's not how the Native Americans were thinking about it when they colonized other parts of America or other nations or other tribes. So it's just this ridiculous self-loathing, navel-gazing bullshit that Westerners, for some reason, choose to engage in.
So I heard like a little conversation the other day with a mother and daughter, and they were from Russia as well. And the daughter is very Western now. And she was explaining to her mother what an emotional trigger was. And the response was very funny. And she just looked at her and said, get something to do. Go find something to do. Right. Western people have nothing wrong compared to what we have had to experience. And that brings me to my point where your viewpoints on Russia and the Ukraine war, and the reason I'm bringing it up, and I am trying to stay away from things you've spoken about, but this does play an important part. The way you were raised makes you incredibly unique when it comes to being able to have conversations. You did not expect the Ukraine war. I don't think you were, told in on it early. It's not like you knew, but you are able to talk about Russia and Ukraine in a very different way, having family on both sides of the war and having grown up in the USSR. So your viewpoints on this war are very different than a lot of people. And you've been somebody who has helped me shift my perspective, because initially, my perspective on war, which is I'm over violence. We're done now. There's too much of it. And violence seems to be the answer to everyone's way of life. And it is this idea that, cannon fodder is acceptable when generations of human beings will no longer exist due to the egomania of so many. And I used to be of this belief. And so I say used to be, so don't yell at me. Don't yell at me.
I have no intention of yelling at you. Although
but you will.
I do wonder whether it's true when you say you're over violence, because I imagine you have guns, and if someone tried to break into your house,
I don't. No, I don't have guns. Ironically, I don't. I know. So got you there. I don't have guns, but
if someone broke into your house,
yes,
I imagine you would be prepared to use violence to defend your children.
For sure. But the difference is I'm not for any other violence other than self-protection. And so I agree with what you're saying when, like, the way this war is.
What about collective self-protection?
No, I agree. It's necessary, but it's how it's being done. That's my thing.
Okay. Well, I don't know what exactly you mean by that, I suppose.
So what I was going to say at the beginning was my belief used to be when you start a war, you don't get to then complain when you're losing. And that wasn't about Russia and Ukraine. I was talking about Israel and Palestine, Israel and Hamas, not even Palestine, Israel and Hamas. Yeah, Hamas doesn't get to complain after you start fucking around. You're going to, that fuck around, find out situation is real. And so I don't agree with the way it's being done, right? But I also agree with your ability to protect yourself. And so that's why I would say you have helped me shift my perspective on that because of the way you've spoken about Russia and Ukraine. So I want to talk a little bit about your viewpoints on that, because you do have a unique perspective other than some advisor or some other individual we're going to have on the show who has no emotional ties to the countries at all.
Okay. I suppose it depends where you begin. Let me sketch out broadly two positions that are, one of them is the mainstream position. The other one is the mainstream anti-mainstream position, right? Okay. So these are the two main views that you will hear. The mainstream position is the Vladimir Putin is Hitler, He started a war. He'll never stop.
The expansionist, right?
Yes, he's a kind of congenital aggressor. He's going to invade Ukraine. He'll take Ukraine, and then he'll take more and more and more and more. And it's because he's a terrible, evil person. And the war was entirely unprovoked. And because of that, we must give Ukraine everything. And by the way, we've done a great job of giving them everything they need. And brave Ukrainians are winning, and everything's great. Right. That's the mainstream position. The mainstream anti-mainstream position, that is very much the Tucker Carlson, John Mearsheimer, all of these other people, is that the reason that the war happened is that the evil Americans interfered in a beautiful pro-Russian democracy in Ukraine. If we hadn't messed around in Russia's backyard, if we hadn't expanded NATO after after NATO was founded, if we hadn't expanded NATO after the Cold War ended, etc., Russia would have been living peacefully ever after, and everything would have been fine. And we should never have been provoking Russia by expanding eastwards. And it's all our fault. And the evil Americans are the reason this is happening. And the Ukrainians, Russia is winning, the Ukrainians are losing. And America has biolabs in Ukraine, and blah 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 blah. We can go. Now, I don't agree with either of those positions because they're both ideological and less than factual on some respects. So let me say what I agree with. Taking a big step back in terms of time, right? If you look at the countries that are giving support to Ukraine today, on a per percentage of GDP basis, the countries that are giving the most in percentage terms of what they can to support Ukraine are not America, are not Canada, are not Britain. It's Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and other countries that are next to Ukraine. Now, why are they doing that? The reason they're doing that, even though they're part of NATO, is that they know from history that Russian and Eastern European history follows a very simple trend. Russia is very insecure on its Western borders, and it has very good reasons to feel insecure. So 80% of Russia's economy, industrial base, scientific base, etc., is located in the westernmost 20% of the country. And that westernmost 20% of the country is basically flat lands that can very easily be invaded. There's no major river systems. There's no major mountain ranges. It's very open to invasion, which has been exploited throughout history from everybody from the Swedes to the Poles to the Germans to the French to the everybody's, right? Which is why Napoleon was able to burn Moscow. Hitler came within literally kilometers of sacking Moscow and probably winning World War II as a result. So Russia feels very vulnerable. And also Russia historically it's an empire. Empires want to expand. That's how they become empires. So what happens in the history of Eastern Europe is every time Russia becomes strong, it expands west, right? So the reason the countries of the region are supporting Ukraine is that they do feel, historically speaking, that they are next, right? That does not necessarily mean that I view Vladimir Putin as Adolf Hitler. He isn't. Right, he's not a genocidal maniac.
I've never heard you say that once, that you've ever had that viewpoint anyway.
No, I don't. But this is what people pretend I say because they want to present me as having the mainstream point of view.
It's just your face.
It's just everything's my face. So I what I'm saying is the countries of the region know that Russia will expand west when it can, right? Now, most of the other countries in the region are now part of NATO, and so they do have that protection in that Russia is very unlikely to ever attack NATO for obvious reasons, right? Attacking NATO would start World War III. Russians do not want World War III. Right?
Does NATO, okay, so let me interrupt for a second here. Does NATO have the power that it used to have?
Well, I would imagine NATO, in terms of its actual military, is probably stronger than it's ever been. Right? In terms of its technological superiority over Russia, in terms of nuclear capacity, all of those things, right? NATO is stronger, and it's much, much stronger than Russia, much, much stronger. But the problem is that once you start war with NATO, you are immediately effectively in a nuclear conflict, because you may not start out in a nuclear conflict, but once one side starts losing, right?
Escalation of violence.
Escalation of violence all the way through to nuclear winter. So from that perspective, it's very unlikely. So the people who say, if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, his tanks are going to be in Berlin, they're wrong, objectively, on the one hand. On the other hand, the way that Russia operates is that once it has Ukraine, it will then start working on the rest of the area. So, for example, Hungary is pro-Russian. I think Slovenia or Slovakia, I always confuse them, one of the other two countries in the region, again, pro-Russian. The Serbia, pro-Russian. So once you've got Ukraine, you can start peeling other pieces away from Western Europe. You can start undermining them. At some point, some of them might leave NATO, etc., etc., etc. Now, so, but the reason, but that's not really why I think we were right to support Ukraine in its defense. The reason I thought we were right to support Ukraine in its defense is that, let me just take a sip of this because my throat's getting tired.
No. While you're doing that, because I had a Hungarian friend. Her daughter goes to our school, and we were chatting the other day, and she came over to me. She speaks very broken English, and she said, "I've seen your show. What do you make of this?" And she flips her phone over, and it's a TikTok that was sent to her by somebody in Hungary, and it was the CCP were hosting these massive events within Hungary, and the Hungarian police, if you were not a journalist or a CCP journalist, to clarify, you weren't even allowed in. You weren't allowed to discuss. You weren't allowed to say anything. And so it doesn't surprise me that Hungary is taking the stance, obviously, with Russia as it is. They're already taking the stance with the CCP. People are just not hearing about it or discussing it publicly.
Right. Yeah. So coming back to why my view was right, that we were right to support Ukraine. So what happened is in 2014, Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea, and he did it not because, the narrative from the anti-people is, the evil CIA interfered in Ukrainian elections, blah, 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 blah. Completely untrue. The Ukrainians had a revolution very much like the American Revolution of their own, because they were very unhappy with the government that they had. And yes, they overthrew the person who was in charge, exactly like the Americans did in 1776. This is what tends to happen, right? But what that meant was this was a massive threat to Russia's control over Sevastopol, which is the base that Russia uses for its Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And Putin couldn't let that happen. So he effectively seized part of Ukraine's land and supported a civil war in the east of Ukraine. And one of the reasons he did this is America at the time was very weak and distracted under Obama and wasn't prepared to challenge that. And he knew that, and he seized the moment. And the conclusion from that point on should have been Vladimir Putin is somebody who wants to rebuild, not the Soviet Union. People keep saying he's trying to complete nonsense. He's trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. Right. And the Russian Empire needs access to the Black Sea. It needs a buffer zone in the West, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So what should have been the conclusion from that point on is we have to do whatever we can to prevent this from happening again. But instead, again, when America is distracted and weak, right? Because you got to remember, the invasion of Ukraine follows the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Putin has been in power for 25 years. Why is he acting now? Because you got a guy with dementia in the Oval Office, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. If you have Obama initially, who was, supposed to be the president who was supposed to fix all things, dropped the most drone bombs over any president in the United States history. It's insane. And then you have now somebody with dementia. It just seems like he's strategically picking when the Democrats are in power.
Well, I don't know if it's about Democrats. The thing about Obama, who I really liked and respected, actually, was just he was not fully cognizant of this power dynamic in the world. He did the same with Taiwan, by the way. I remember speaking to a guy called Harold Malgrim, who was an advisor to like 4 US presidents. And he was talking about the fact that the Chinese, when Obama came in, they started testing him and they started building more and more these fake islands, right? In the South China Sea. And they know the Americans are watching with the satellites. So they go, okay, what if we build this one? Do they do anything? No. Okay, let's build another one. And they kept edging forward and forward and forward and forward. So Obama, on many ways, I really liked. But on that respect, he didn't understand how the game's played. And so what happened in 2022 was yet another attempt to bite more of Ukraine off, right? Because of Western weakness, which I'd been warning. You say I didn't predict the war in Ukraine. Actually, I kind of did. If you read the preface to my book, you will see that I was saying if the West continues to be weak and signal weakness, we're in for some really dangerous times. I think I've been proven right on that. And so the reason I thought it was important to support Ukraine is to show Vladimir Putin that we're not prepared to let him keep doing more and more and more of the same, right? Now, if the Ukrainians had decided, you know what, we don't want to fight. We don't want to fight. Let Putin install a pro-Russian government, right? That's kind of what happened in 2014. In 2014, there wasn't, the Ukrainian government tried to fight these rebels in the east. It kind of got frozen. Nothing major happened. But when I called some of my friends when the war broke out in 2022, like some guy who's like an overweight IT consultant, and I said, listen, I've spoken to people high up in the British government. I don't think Kiev is going to hold more than 3 weeks. You got to get out. You got to get your family out. Let me help you. Let me buy you a ticket, whatever. And I still remember this guy said, we're not letting this happen again. This is our country. We're not leaving. Right? So if the Ukrainians didn't want to fight, okay. But the Ukrainians wanted to fight for their country. They wanted us to help them to defend their country. That was their choice. Our choice is whether we help them or not, right? Now, I think it's in the long-term interest of Western countries to prevent Russia and to degrade its ability to do more of this, which it can and will elsewhere all around the world. I mean, the Wagner Group is all over Africa. You know this, right?
I'm so glad you brought up Africa because holy hell, no one's paying attention over there.
Right. So they're in Syria. We are in a Cold War period, right? We got to make sure that there's a very high cost to pushing on our boundaries, right? Now, you can have the John Marsh argument, which we'll get to in a second, which is, well, we are on Russia's boundaries. We've got Russia surrounded. Okay, we can talk about that. But first and foremost, I think it's very important that we deter further expansion in every direction, right? Because it's not in our interest. It's not in our interest to be weak. It's not in our interest to be seen as weak. And what happens, by the way, is that, this is a kind of king of the hill type of situation. When people think you are strong, they don't come for you.
Right.
But when they think you're weak, they all come for you at once. And then it doesn't matter how strong you are because you can't handle everybody at once.
Right.
Right. Which is why the world is always ruled in a heads on spikes kind of way. You come after me, we're going to smack you down. Right. And then other people are going to get the idea this is not a good time to mess with us. Right. So that's from my perspective. Having said that, I also wrote an article more recently saying it's time to end the war in Ukraine. And the reason is there's clearly not the appetite in the West to keep supporting them at the level they need to actually succeed.
Well, because that was my question, right?
Yes.
It's one thing if you are supporting a nation. We saw the abortion of Afghanistan for 20 years. We've seen that. Everybody's seen it across the globe. If you haven't seen it across the globe, you're not paying attention to absolutely anything. But the Afghan pullout and the way that we left Afghanistan and we replaced it with the Taliban, but just with $1 billion worth of equipment that's now showing up in Palestine. So the concern I have is I support the country's right to protect itself, and I always will, because what are you supposed to do? It's no different with Israel. What are you supposed to do? You have to respond to what just happened, but it has to be overwhelming in order to not have it continue. But the problem I'm seeing here, especially in Canada, is people are tired of sending our money to every single other country. We have no weapons. We have no artillery rounds. We're sending people to go play war games. These people are having to pay for their own flights and their own equipment because we are so disproportionately sending everything we have everywhere else. And so is America. We don't have the soldiers. You don't have the soldiers. America for sure as hell doesn't have the soldiers. They're starting to institute the draft even with women. So what does that say? How many more wars can we keep fighting for everybody else except for ourselves?
I think that's a great argument. And that's one of the reasons I was extremely against the war in Iraq. I was extremely against our involvement in various other conflicts in the Middle East. I didn't see that as being in the national interest of the US, the UK, Canada, and other Anglosphere countries. But we have to separate, right? They're different, the different conflicts, right? Because this is the problem. This is why I was so against Iraq. I said, if we undermine our moral authority, if we are seen to be doing things for the wrong reasons, if we waste money and lives and everything on these types of conflicts for which there is no rational basis and we lie to our own people through the media to get them to agree to this, they will not believe us again. And so we are in the boy who cried wolf situation. And now, when there actually is a conflict that is affecting us directly, in my opinion, that is in our national security interest to support Ukraine properly, if that's what they want us to do, now people are tired. And I fully understand that, which is why, as I said, I wrote an article saying it's time to wrap up the war, because Ukrainians are not making forward progress, and they haven't done for more than a year. In the initial phase, they actually did incredibly well.
Yes.
And what should have happened, in my opinion, either at that point, we should have gone, okay, they're crushing. Let's give them everything they need. Let's give them the stuff that they need straight away. By the way, that's very dangerous because, Putin he rattled the nuclear saber and he scared Biden, right? He said, if you keep giving them stuff, we're going to have to use tactical nukes. Now, they were never going to do that. But if you're President Biden, you can't take that chance, or perhaps you think you can't, right? So that was one option. The other option was to say, look, you've got your territory back, right? You're winning. How about we do a deal with the Russians where you say, look, you get to save face, you get to keep Crimea, you get to keep the eastern regions, which haven't been under your control for this entire time. And in exchange, we do like a Korea scenario, or we find some semi-NATO thing, or we put some physical protection in place, like the UN or something, where Russia physically cannot invade again, right? We don't need to continue the massacres that are taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians, and freeze the conflict there. That's what I think probably should have happened. That didn't happen because of the mainstream rah, 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 Ukrainians are winning, they're going to win, blah, blah, blah position, right? Now let's look at the the people who call themselves anti-war. What they actually mean is they're pro-Russia winning the war, which is what they actually mean, right? I'm not saying their intention, I'm not saying they're Putin puppets or they're funded by Russia. I'm just saying, if you look at the fact of what they're saying, the result of following their advice would be that Russia gets to win the war, right? That's all I'm saying. Clear. So that argument is this, Russia is reacting to provocation, which is NATO expansion. Now, my view is there is an element of that is true. It is absolutely 100% true that NATO expanding closer to Russia's borders is an irritant to Russia.
Of course it is.
We talked about the fact that Russia feels insecure, right? You are adding to Russia's insecurity by expanding NATO further east. Having said that, the question was always going to be, where do you stop NATO expansion, right? And that's the question that no one ever asked these people. Okay, so should we let Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania in? Because that was also a massive irritant to Russia. We know that. The Russians said it at the time. The only reason they didn't do what they're doing in Ukraine is they were too weak, right? And so and the reason I ask this question is very important, Kelsey, because if we hadn't expanded into Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, if we hadn't expanded into Poland, if we hadn't expanded into all of Eastern Europe, where do you think Vladimir Putin's troops would be today?
Well, I feel like it's a hard question to answer because we'll never know. I think that
I don't know about that. Vladimir Putin is very clear on the record as saying the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. He's very clear on the record saying that America is evil for attempting to overturn the post-World War II order. What was the post-World War II order? It was Russian tanks in Berlin. It was Russian tanks in Hungary, as you know. It was Russian tanks in Czechoslovakia, as you know. It was Russia's complete domination of all of Eastern Europe up to and including Eastern Germany. Now, that is the natural trend for Russia when it's powerful and when those countries are unprotected. So we expanded NATO eastwards to protect all of those countries from once again being subjugated by Russia. Now, should we have stopped at Ukraine? Well, we have now been messing around and we found out, yes, we should have done, right? That does not necessarily mean that NATO expansion, which is what they all talk about, was a bad idea. The other thing is, at the end of the day, it wasn't us that made Ukraine want to join NATO. Just like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and others, they wanted to join NATO.
They want the protection.
They want the protection, right? Now, should we have been dangling that carrot in front of them as we get weaker and there's a resurgent Putin? Maybe not. That's what we've now discovered, right? However, I don't think this simple blanket of like NATO should never, NATO should have been disbanded is what these people say. Very, very dumb.
They think that NATO should be fully disbanded.
Yeah. A lot
As other countries go together in the BRICS and decide that we're going to go up against NATO, they decided that NATO shouldn't exist.
Well, a lot of these people have decided ultimately that the West is evil and therefore anything that's against the West is good. They genuinely have, right? So I think the argument that Russia is provoked by NATO's potential expansion into Ukraine is accurate. I don't think that means that NATO should not have been expanding eastwards. I think it should have been done with a much more measured and much more careful way. And by the way, one of the reasons we know, and this will, I think, float your boat, is that the reason that NATO expanded eastward as rapidly and as aggressively and with so much hunger as it did is not because it was a geopolitical strategic plan, but rather because Western arms manufacturers massively benefit from retooling the armies of Eastern European countries with Western kit. Right. So the fact that, I mean, nobody, I think, would deny that the military industrial complex has its fingers in a lot of pies, and sometimes to the detriment of many things, including what's happening in Ukraine. My only argument is when Russia invaded, we were where we were. And our job in that situation, I think, was A, to support the Ukrainians to get the best deal that they could. That would have been achieved by trying to sign a peace treaty as the Ukrainians were moving forward. It's going to be a lot harder now that they're moving backward or in a brutal stalemate. And given that the level of public support for continuing to support Ukraine at a level that actually allows them to be effective instead of just throwing conscripts into the meat grinder, the Western support is not there. Now is the time, and this is where we come back to the very beginning of our conversation about the next president of the United States. The way to solve this conflict now is whoever's the next president of the United States has to be able to come in and say, listen, Vlad, you've got two choices here, right? One choice is we do a deal where you get Ukrainian territory, you get to keep Crimea, you get to keep some of the land that you've conquered, right? And Ukraine gets sovereignty. We're going to put some kind of peacekeeping force in, or the Korea scenario, or maybe if you're really good negotiator, you can even get Ukraine into NATO and go, look, you keep this part of it, we'll get this part into NATO. Everybody to that corner. Probably very unlikely, but nonetheless. Or if you don't want to do this deal, which is fair to both sides, I'm going to give Ukrainians fucking everything. Right? And that's how you get Putin, A, to the table, and then B, to do the right deal. I'm not saying you would want to give the Ukrainians everything. Right. I don't think that that's realistic, but I'm just saying you need somebody who is that level of negotiator who can sell Putin on the idea that this is the best deal you're going to get. And if you don't take this now, the deal is going to get worse over time.
Well, and of course, so I heard Putin recently this week talk about Trump after the debate, stating that Trump before he even gets in power, before he even takes office, this war will be done. He will sit down, and they asked Putin, they said, what do you think of what Trump had to say? And he seemed receptive in some way. And I don't know if it's because somehow on some level he respects some aspect of him and the willingness to stand up to him or what it is, but he seemed more receptive. But my concern is everybody says we've been giving Ukraine kind of weapons and we've been giving Ukraine training. But when I have people that go on the ground who are there quite frequently, and I mean frequently, they are tasked with training these guys that are going to go to the front lines. And the saddest part about it is these guys are training in sweatpants and running shoes and sticks for weapons. So my question is, if Ukraine was so worthy of giving, like if this government was so worthy of giving all of these funds and all of these amazing weapon systems to, why are they not making it to the front lines in the way that they're telling the Western world they are? And we know that they're not when his wife is driving around in a brand new $4 million Bugatti. My question is, if we are doing these things and we're going to give you everything we have, we're going to give you, Canada gave $350 million last year, I think it was. And on average, I can't get into a family doctor. I can't get treatment for post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or anything along those lines. If we're going to give everything away at the sacrifice of the Canadians within this country, then it damn well better be going to where it say it's going. But we know for a fact it's not. This is the same issue we've seen time and time again, war after war. We just need to turn the machine so that the machine just magically can make all of the weapons and all of the economic state to be better. But we've seen that with, it just feels like funny timing as Afghan pullout stops and we have no more war and we're no longer supporting an economic state with the machine that is constantly turning weaponry, all of a sudden another war just pops off. I can't help but the conspiracy side of me just go, we're never ever not going to have another war, and we have to keep it going. Furthermore, if you take it to the very beginning of the war, and this is obviously, I'm not in the room, the rumors are we had an opportunity for a peace deal. We had an opportunity to sit down and have this conversation.
That, but Naftali Bennett, who's quoted as being the person who said this, actually, when he was asked about it, said that that really wasn't the case. It was 50-50. There was no real deal on the table, right? So, but people, look, I wasn't in the room either. And 50-50 means that a deal may have been possible. My understanding is what happened was when the Russians pulled out from the north of Kiev, that's when we discovered the Bucha massacre. And from that point on, it was very difficult to get the Ukrainians to come to the table on anything, because they were like,
and fair enough.
A, we're winning, and B, these people are evil. We got to fight them to the last man type of thing, right? Now, your point about corruption, I think, is important. And all of Eastern Europe is incredibly corrupt. That didn't stop us from giving Lend-Lease to the Soviets, right?
Correct.
So if you're trying to win a war, you have to recognize that not all the equipment is necessarily going to make it to the front line. And that's bad and should be condemned. And corruption is bad. And I'm not saying it's good, right? Having said that, we are not giving the Ukrainians all these super complicated weapon systems.
No, we're not.
What we're actually doing is just giving them some small arms, some artillery, and then a bunch of shells and ammunition for those things. That's really what we gave them. Some tanks, not a huge amount. I still don't think we've given them any fighter planes. We've given them some anti-aircraft systems, which were basically to defend their key cities and strategic facilities against missile attacks and drone attacks. So I know that we're talking about huge numbers, but actually in terms of giving them, you know, like the HIMARS, for example, that made a huge difference. That's a very old weapon system. We are giving them junk that we need to replace, really, right? So ultimately, I said this from the beginning, you have to make a choice. Either you want Ukraine to win, in which case you know, win, depending on what you mean exactly by that. But like, right, say push the Russian invaders out of Ukraine. If you want to do that, you're going to have to spend a hell of a lot of money and give them a hell of a lot of weapons and ramp up weapon production in the West. Or let's stop pretending. Let's stop pretending. Let's stop pretending we want them to win. Let's stop pretending that they're doing well. And let's just say, look, guys, like, we want you to win. Here's some AK-47s that we've got in a depot somewhere. Good luck. This is all we've got. And then the Ukrainians would immediately go, okay, well, the rational thing for us to do is to cut a deal with Russia because we can't keep fighting. What we've done instead is the worst of both worlds. We have said, rah, 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 Ukraine, we're backing you to the hilt, and then giving them some stuff which is just enough to keep them fighting, but not enough to help them win, right? So when I'm talking about how this gets solved by the next president of the United States, who for this reason I hope is Donald Trump out of the two choices that are currently available as we sit here, is because he can come in and he can credibly say to Vladimir Putin, listen, I'm as tough and crazy as you are, right? So either we cut a deal now that's fair to you and fair to the Ukrainians and fair to the United States, or I'm going to make this the best deal ever that you ever had a chance to sign. That's the only way you get a good deal here. And that's it's going to take a lot of very skilled negotiation.
No, it will. And that's, I mean, he's the only one I have hope for, because I don't see this happening under Biden. And I don't see it happening with any of his other individuals around him, especially not Kamala. She can't string a sentence together to save her life. So I want to pivot a little bit onto something a little more personal, because I think, obviously, if anybody wants to hear your perspective on the war, you do speak about it often. And I would like to talk about your writing, because you, as an individual coming from multiple different languages and being able to articulate the way that you do in English better than most Anglophones on a good day, your writing seems to not match your personality and or your face. And so your writing is I find it very tangible, very filled with expression and emotion. And it actually has more emotion, like I said, than your face gives off regularly. So what is it about writing for you that seems to be a different outlet, a different way of communicating? And how did you become such a strong writer in the first place?
That's a good question, actually. I've never thought about it. I guess it's practice and reading a lot as well. I think the way I think about languages, I almost like you pick up bits of phraseology. So I don't really think that we think in words. I think we think in like phrases or sentences. So the more you read, the more you have of these beautiful turns of phrase that you can then combine together in different combinations and weave together into things. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, you say, you keep talking about my face. The fact that like I don't express a lot of emotion doesn't mean that I don't experience emotion. And most of all, it doesn't mean that I don't recognize that the best way to reach other people is by connecting to something emotional. And that I kind of got from when I was doing stand up, because people laugh a lot harder at a visual image that they can see as opposed to a conceptual joke, which is where I always found it more interesting. So, in my Oxford speech, for example, when I'm talking about, you know, I could say, poor people don't want to be poorer, or I could tell you a story about what it's like to have a child come into the world and how you think about them and how you experience that. And then, the choice that many people have where we could have more climate policies and my child has a high risk of dying.
Or the button.
Or yeah, exactly. So that's a kind of visual image that immediately connects with almost every human being. And so I recognize that in order to connect with people, you have to do it through emotion. It just doesn't come naturally to me.
Well, no, it's your writing is really beautiful that way, where it does paint pictures very well. And when you do give speeches that you can see that you have written in a way where it's designed to paint the picture, it is very visceral. It does evoke a lot of emotion. And listening to the Oxford one now a few times in a row, the ability that you have to not only disregard somebody else interrupting you and not lose your train of thought and kind of come back is really impressive, to say the least. If anybody has done a keynote or any sort of public talk, you're able to see how difficult that can be. And the fact that you're able to kind of, no, thank you your way through that.
That part of it is just stand up and stage time. So,
right.
Stage time is like air miles on the clock. You just need to do a certain amount of stage time to feel comfortable on stage. And then also with stand up, you're used to dealing with hecklers all the time. So then, in that particular instance, I just wanted to get on. In another situation, I'd make fun of them. In another situation, I'd call them out. So, for example, that Doha debate thing I was telling you about, when I started talking about slavery, this entire time they'd been talking about how the West is not living up to its standards on free speech. And when I started talking about slavery, they all started shouting me down. And I went, you keep talking about free speech. You don't seem to be that big fans of it anymore. What happened? So it's just kind of, and that mostly is just about being in the moment and going, most of the 99% of the time, people who are shouting something out from the audience, like if you think about it, most sane people wouldn't be doing that. So that person is typically saying something incredibly dumb and therefore not that hard to deal with.
So that brings me to how you met your work wife, Franny. How did you guys link up together? Because you do seem like you would have, I know comedy, but how is it that you two in particular got in the room together and decided that you wanted to make a show?
So we used to gig a lot at the same comedy club. Francis used to run a comedy show there and I would come and perform there regularly. And then I started helping him out to run it and we just spent time together. And this was around 2016 probably. So there were a lot of things happening culturally that we, it was almost like being like in a communist society, the woke comedy industry in the UK, because it was like, oh, you think that too? Oh, and then you'd whisper it. And so very quickly we discovered that we were two people who were not aligned with all of the cultural stuff that was happening around us. And as we felt more trust, and I was like, well, why don't we start a YouTube channel? Because I'd seen people in America talking about the issues that I was interested in talking about. At the time, it was Rogan and Rubin and people like that were doing shows that I felt were opening up the conversation and bringing on different voices. I remember just like the first time I saw Larry Elder on Dave Rubin, I was like, oh my God, inject this into my veins, please. And then one of the things that really happened for me is when I discovered Larry Elder, I then find out about Thomas Sowell. And then I just inhaled every single thing that he's ever written. I mean, that's not true. He's written so much that I probably haven't read most of it, actually. But I've inhaled a hell of a lot of it, videos, books, articles, everything. And that is a guy who's written literally an explanation of literally everything that's happening everywhere in the world all at once. Whatever issue you and I have talked about today, he's written about it in an incredibly eye-opening, persuasive way. I mean, DEI, race and racism, slavery, colonialism, what's happening in Israel. He wrote an incredible article in 2014, the last time this thing flared up, basically saying how ceasefires are moronic, and the entire point, or what happens when you have a ceasefire is you prevent the aggressor from being punished and deterred from future aggression, and you therefore produce much more aggression, which is why ceasefires to ceasefires to ceasefire causes violence after violence after violence, right? And that, so for me, that period was incredibly educational. And then trigonometry became really, somebody said this to me the other day, and I never thought about it like this, but like Rogan knows so much. And I was we were talking with the person, he said, well, of course, he's got like 4 PhDs worth of education.
Yeah.
Because he's talked to so many people. Now, some of those people are not, PhD level educators. They're MMA fighters and this and that and whatever. But he's talked to a hell of a lot of smart people on the record, off the record. And so he's incredibly educated. And that's what I wanted for myself. First and foremost, when we started trigonometry, we just wanted to understand what the hell was happening around us. And it was a kind of labor of curiosity before anything else.
When I was thinking about that, and the way that you two balance each other on the show is really hard to do for most people, having a co-host like that. You guys seem to really ping pong well, and you're able to read the room really well and ask depending on who the person is, the person will ask the question. I find where it's something a little more intellectually heavy, I do see that you'll take the lead if it's something you're really interested in. And if it's something a little more along the lines of like the comedy specter, I see that Francis will jump in a little bit earlier. And you do have this really amazing dance that happens. And I think it's important to point out, because so many people don't understand how difficult it is to sit in front of somebody as intelligent as yourself, but it's also, they don't understand how hard it is to sit across from you and then have another person who's also interested in the conversation and be able to balance off of each other. And I've seen you do that in person, and it is impressive. But kind of in the way that you do your show, I was thinking about how I wanted to bring up a last question, because you do ask a really good question at the end of your show, which is, what is the thing that we're not talking about? And I thought to myself, I don't want to ask that question, but somebody I would love to see you interview is Trump. And so I thought to myself, what is the one major issue that you would bring up to him if you had the opportunity?
I think there is 100 different ways that you could approach that. So you could talk to him about, how are you going to solve the Ukraine-Russia thing really? Like, what are you going to say? What is that going to be like? What have you, in terms of you wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. Like, I'm not saying you're necessarily going to share with our audience exactly how you would talk to him, but like, what are some of the approaches that you're thinking about? Like, what are you trying to offer him? What do you want? That kind of thing. You could do that. Another question might be is, Mr. President, do you think that, even many of your fans would concede that you are, because of the way that you carry yourself and speak, a divisive figure? Do you think that there are elements of your personality that you could improve on or work on to make yourself more palatable to more Americans and bring more of the country with you? I think that would be an interesting thing. I think ultimately it would have to be a question that delved deeper into either something that he's said he's going to do, or something that he, you might think he should do better, or, to hear about that. So those are probably the two things that I would immediately go with. Yeah.
And when you're looking ahead at your life, because you guys have expanded so rapidly, you're about to hit 1 million subscribers on YouTube, which is a huge feat to do. You've consistent with your episodes, consistent with hitters. You have amazing guests, and you have a huge team behind you. What do you see for yourself and Francis in the next 5 years as everything grows and you start to take on this whole new persona with ARC and with so many other areas?
Well, I'm really not looking that far ahead, because so many amazing things. I'm very privileged and very lucky. So many amazing things are happening. So this year I had the great opportunity to tour with Jordan Peterson and open for him. You came to the Austin show, which was really fun. so that if you'd said to me a year ago that that's what I'd be doing, I wouldn't necessarily have believed you, although I kind of would have done, but also not. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So for me, all I'm interested in with trigonometry is really for us to keep having the important conversations, to keep getting better as individual people. For me, that definitely means to be more measured, to be more precise with my language, to be calmer, and that means to be more ruthless if I'm in a debate. If I get too emotional, I think that takes away from my ability to really be clinical. So just to keep working on myself, keep growing. Um, I'm. We talked briefly about parenthood. I'm a father now, so I want the thing that I really learned from Jordan, that I really, really learned, among many other things, is that if you want to be great, which I do, you cannot. Greatness is multifaceted. You can't be great in one thing and be great at that sustainably. If you,
Mm.
like Tiger Woods is a very good example of this. This guy has all the God-given talent that he's then practiced from God knows what age to really make himself into the best golfer in the world. And then he gets derailed by his personal life, which he's not great in, right? He hasn't
That's a good way to put it.
he hasn't found a way to deal with the fame and the availability of all of the things that are available to him in a way that makes him a great person in that respect. And then that affects your career because you're human, right? And this is,
Mhm.
the thing I'm really focusing on right now is health and well-being, because I recognize not only, having a duty to my wife and my son and all the rest of it, but, and my team here that, rely on me to be at the top of my game. But it's just like, I can't think great if I'm not feeling great, if I'm not in
Mm.
great shape, if I'm worried about. So I'm spending a hell of a lot of time on the treadmill and eating things that don't taste good and all of this other stuff, just to looking after myself, making sure I'm in good condition. I'm able to be present. I've got good energy levels, so that I can be a good leader, so that I can be a good interviewer, so that I can be a great speaker, so that I can do the other things that I do. And then, I'm excited for Francis. He's really leaning into stand up. He's
Yeah.
writing a book, which I think is going to be fantastic. I'm writing a second book a lot slower than he is. I'll be speaking at ARC again, and, lots of other opportunities are coming my way. So all I'm really trying to do is be a little bit better every day. And I found that over the course of a lifetime, that tends to add up to quite a lot.
Well, I can see that even from before I met you to the difference after you were with Jordan. There is a difference.
Mm.
There is a softer side of you, whether you want to hear that or not.
Yeah.
I don't mean doughier side. I mean, there is an emotional opening. There's a crack in the door is what I would say. And with that
Mm.
crack comes all the light. And it's a really beautiful thing to witness. You're a lot less pale. You look a lot fitter. And you look like you're actually present in things that, well, before it just seemed like you were interested, but now it seems like you're all in. You're both feet all the way in. And it's a really cool thing to witness.
Well, I don't know if I've talked about this publicly before. I probably haven't, but um, all my life, since I was a little kid, I always had, um, I've always had almost like the weight of the world on my shoulders. That I put it there myself, but I always knew that I had something special to offer the world, and I didn't experience that as an opportunity. I experienced that as pressure. And
Mm.
so all my life, up to like a year or two ago, really, uh, I always felt that I was not fulfilling that destiny, that I was not fulfilling whatever I was here to do. And it was only when I think that what happened when my Oxford speech, and it's done like hundreds of millions of views now around the world, it really changed the way, yeah, I kind of went from like, oh, I'm just doing this thing and YouTube and it's great, and to when I went to America after that, and like all the people that I thought of as my heroes, they were all sort of saying like, "Welcome, brother. You're one of us," you know.
Hmm.
Um, and I just suddenly it felt like I stopped being this guy who's trying to run so fast that he's not fully present in himself. I just kind of stepped into who I'm supposed to be. I slowed down. I was like, okay, I'm gonna make it, kind of thing. Um, and from that moment on, it's just allowed me to take that pressure off myself and then just to be who I'm supposed to be. which has made it a lot easier. But that doesn't mean there are not challenges along the way. And you mentioned me looking fitter. I put on a lot. Actually, people laugh when I say this, but I did put a lot of weight on over the last year, and that's because again, I was driving myself really hard to like go get it, go do this and whatever, and I didn't see it in the round. I am still as like driven, go, go, go as I've always been. I just see that there's more than one area in which I'm supposed to be driven and determined and perform at the highest level. And one of them is like being at home with my family. Like that's where I'm supposed to be great, you know? So I'm really working on that as well as my health and everything else.
Well, I think that shows the growth, right? When you realize that it's not just about the external, but it's about what's goes on around you. You know,
Yeah.
you're the sum of the five of everything. So it's a beautiful thing to witness. And I'm glad, because when finally somebody does look at you and say that you are great, I do know what that feels like. And I know that you know that that comes from you. So as much as you are leading, you are also inspiring, and you are also helping others see that they can be just as great if they put the effort in. So thank you for that. And thanks for the time today, buddy.
I appreciate it, Kelsey. Thank you so much. Our friendship is something I really treasure. And by the way, I could see how you know, you really looked into stuff for our conversation, because I usually get asked about basically similar stuff, and we swayed away from that, and that's thanks to you really being prepared. So thanks for a great interview.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Anytime you know you're always welcome. You can insert yourself in my life at any point. But can you tell everyone where they can support Trig and you and everything that you do?
So we're TRIGGERnometry on YouTube, at TriggerPod on all the social media, and I'm at Konstantin Kisin. My website, which is direct link to my Substack, is konstantinkisin.com.
And I do recommend everybody go and read his Substack. Do it. It is absolutely fantastic. They are not super long reads, which I think makes it super digestible. And also the most recent stuff you've come out with is absolutely banging. So thank you for that. You stick with me. Everyone else, we will see you all next week.